We have three organisations represented here today. We in this panel, the British Museum, we have JD Hill from the British Museum. He's head of research at that organisation, responsible for the strategic direction and the management of the museum. He'll be followed by two representatives from National Museums Northern Ireland. William Blair, who's Director of Collections there, part of the executive leadership team, and Hannah Crowdy, who's Head of Curatorial, so with a special responsibility for National Museums Northern Ireland's core development of collections. And then finally, from Northern Ireland Museums Council, we have Shivan Stevenson, who's Director of IMC, and again, responsible for the strategic leadership. So people who are very much at the cutting edge of leadership within these major organisations and responsible for the kinds of collaborations that we want to talk about today. So without any further ado, I'll pass over to JD Hill. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's nice to know I'm now responsible for strategic direction of the whole museum. My bosses might be surprised at that. Hi, I'm Head of Research at the British Museum. I'm responsible, as I said, for all of our research and our research collaborations in the museum, but I'm also quite an active member of the Independent Research Organisations Group, which brings together many of the cultural organisations across the UK which support research. And I was very pleased to be able to visit you all in person 2 years ago, and I hope to come back to you again, see you all again in person soon. I want to set the scene and talk a little bit about what has changed in my organisation and perhaps bigger organisations in general, and think a little bit about what does that mean about collaborations and research with universities. I'll quickly go over this because I don't want to take up too much time, because I'd like to have more time for discussion. But I think in some ways, I think there, for me, thinking this through, I think there are 5 or 6 big shifts which have happened over the last 2 years. The last 2 years, I think, for anyone who works in a museum or heritage organisation, have been incredibly painful. For someone who has simply got used to living with objects and working with objects and seeing people interact with my collections every single day, forcibly being told to get out of the building, and then not even being able to travel to London for 18 months has been hard. But I think one of the things I think the last 18 months has done is, I think for many organisations, this has been a time for reflection and thinking about what our future priorities should be. And while there's been a huge shift across many areas of what's happened in our organisation in this last 18 months, many of these things were already happening. We were already seeing tectonic plates shifting in the way people interact with collections, how they engage and consume culture, with the whole question about the future of the UK and our identity. What's happened over the last 18 months is suddenly there's been an earthquake. Those tectonic plates have just jumped dramatically, and that's been causing the extreme pain we've been encountering and the challenges which we now do. Now, thinking through those changes, the very obvious one is that cultural organisations and heritage organisations have faced severe financial difficulties over the last 18 months, and many of us are still going to be facing severe financial difficulties going forwards. Some organisations have had very large cuts in their workforces, others have not had to do that cut so far yet, but that financial situation which we now all face is much harder than it was 2 years ago, and that really does mean that organisations have got to focus very, very clearly on what their obvious priorities are going to be for the going forward. Clearly, we've also seen how vulnerable the economic funding models for major cultural organisations in the UK have been, which have been effectively very dependent on visitor income, sponsorship, and selling profits from selling cups of coffee in our shops and cafes. That collapse in that income has challenged our organisations, and that's something we need to think about going forwards. And that's actually something perhaps to think about with economists and business experts in universities. So the financial situation is a major issue. But I think what we've also seen here is a big shift in our visitor behaviour, but I think that was already happening. London audiences have collapsed. We are not expecting international visitors and visitors to London to recover potentially for another 3 to 4 years to post-pandemic levels. That makes a huge difference for us. But I think in some ways, what we're already seeing is increasingly before the pandemic, we were seeing evidence for much more focus on people visiting heritage and cultural attractions in their local immediate area. And I think that is still there. And I think we may actually see a great reluctance for people from parts of the UK to travel to London to visit exhibitions and consume culture. And I think that's a big shift. And that's a big challenge, which I think national organisations were already addressing. Most national organisations in the UK already had big programmes of working with local and regional partners. That is only going to become more important to us as we go forwards in the next few years. But on the other hand, when visitors come back to our organisations, what's reassuring is how important the interaction with real things, real properties, real objects, and real life experiences matter. And I think that's quite important when we compare that with, it's not that there is a shift to the digital. There has been a big shift to the digital over the last year and a half. We've seen a much greater consumption of digital resources from cross-cultural organisations. That has exposed how little investment many of our organisations can afford to make in the digital, and that may have to change. But I also think fundamentally it's exposed the existing weaknesses in how cultural and heritage organisations best use digital technologies to engage audiences and provide access online to our collections. These were things which were already being discussed beforehand, but the last 18 months have really brought these home in a very big way. And then my two final issues are, the first is Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter has transformed everything we do and think in major UK national organisations. It's not that we weren't addressing these issues before, but the Black Lives Matter movement and moment has really forced these issues to the front of what we do and how we confront them. Again, that poses challenges. Many of these are coming back to digital challenges about how do we as cultural organisations make transparent our own histories and the histories of our collections for anyone to actually look at and explore and expose. That takes time, it takes money. And it forces us again to confront how we're going to deal with some of the different challenges dealing with these histories. At the same time, I'm actually find this a positive moment. The very fact that people care about toppling statues actually is incredibly reassuring for someone who works in a museum who thinks that things matter and history matters. And I think that is reassuring. How we deal with those issues is a challenge. And because that's actually something which I actually look to my colleagues in Northern Ireland to help with. You have much more experience of how to deal with these challenging histories in appropriate ways. And again, before the pandemic, that was something which a number of the London organisations were already wanting to come and learn more from you about. And then the final area is climate change. Again, climate change has really come home over the last 18 months in my institution and other cultural institutions. We tour objects around the world. How we tour those objects around the world, how we think about storage of our collections, how we stop our historic buildings simply leaking when it pours with rain, like it did in the southeast of England yesterday, are now major questions which all of our organisations have really got to face up to and are really starting to pay a lot of attention to. So those are the key challenges which I see. And I think all of those are issues which we can explore further with university collaborations. The big challenge is going to be, I think, building our collaborations and building future research is, cultural and heritage organisations like mine are going to be very focused on identifying what we have to do. And that's going to make far less space for perhaps some of the more explorative relationships we were having with universities. We've got to have a list of things. We've got to do this. We've got to do this, and we've got to do it in the next few years. And so the question, I think, is going to be, how do we find ways for colleagues in universities to understand what our priorities are, and so that they can then fit in with what we're doing? We also might need different models of working. I think already 2 years ago, we were starting to realize there was a limit to the type of work a cultural organization can do in full partnership with a university, because we have limited staff. Do we need to develop new models, more of a commissioning model to working with a university, saying, look, this is the spec, this is the research we need. Can you go away and help deliver that research? I mean, that's a key challenge. At the same time, I think there are going to be greater opportunities. The UK government is even more committed for cultural organisations to be working around the whole of the UK than it was before. And I think that is going to be really a big driver in how all of our big cultural organisations are actually thinking about developing our research strategies and our research partnerships. I think is a big opportunity which we need to capture on. And I think finally, again, thinking about other opportunities, that shift to the local, to the local as being the key area in which many people are going to increasingly build visitor numbers, build engagement with local culture, again, I think provides a huge window of opportunity for universities to work with their own cultural and heritage organisations in their own immediate areas. And I think the final thing to say, when thinking about universities, when I think about research working with universities, I'm not just thinking about the research product, I'm actually thinking about how the process of research is training the future generations of researchers who are going to work in universities and our organisations. The job situation at the moment is very challenging, but that actually means that we probably need to be investing even more in thinking about providing the young researchers we work with the skills and the experiences which they are going to need to make sure that they get jobs, and actually to make sure that my organisation and other organisations can do the things they need to do. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much, JD. Lots to think about there, lots of challenges, as you say, in the sector. I'm now going to hand over to William and Hannah, who are going to share with us some of their thoughts from the perspective of National Museums Northern Ireland.
Well, good morning, everybody. I think first thing to say is so much of what JD has said there previously does also resonate with us. COVID-19 has been a huge challenge, really the greatest in our history. It's, I think financially, it's been probably where we felt the most acute kind of crisis, and that, our income streams kind of have some of our most important income streams collapsed as a result of having to close our museums. I think also just in terms of the welfare issues that are presented for our staff, in terms of both those who were furloughed and those who weren't furloughed, were a particular challenge. So it has been a very difficult 2 years, and I think there is an important but. It has also offered an opportunity to pause for thought. We've been on a journey of transformation, and we've been rethinking and redefining, in a sense, our sense of purpose. We've been moving away from what was maybe previously a rather dominant visitor attraction model to reconnecting with more profoundly with a sense of, well, what are we really here for, and what do our collections actually offer, and how can we unlock their potential for the benefit of this society. And it has, paradoxically, in a sense, lockdown did present an opportunity for us to step off the treadmill, and to it acted in some ways as a catalyst, an opportunity for us to accelerate our thinking And in that sense, it's actually been a very productive 2 years. We have put in place, for example, a new corporate strategy for the organization, which is really a distillation of our thinking. And I think the important, I suppose, in terms of understanding our priorities, it's very clear really what they are, because we've defined them really in terms of our outcomes wheel, and you can see it there, whether it's, and there's a renewed emphasis on things like climate and sustainable development, helping people understand multiple perspectives of history, culture and identity, good relations, understanding our, how we contribute to the local economy, access and participation. So everything we do really in that sense needs to contribute to delivering these outcomes. And within our corporate strategy, we've also made 4 core commitments to champion inclusion, diversity and accessibility, to create more ways to get involved, to extend the impact of our collections, and to build a museum infrastructure of the future. And obviously extending the impact of our collections research is absolutely key to that. And I think there are important opportunities to grow and develop our partnerships with local universities in particular, and more widely. We've also accelerated our process of master planning, and in that sense, it's really, I suppose you could describe master planning almost as establishing a clear development framework for each of our sites and for the organization as a whole. And this has kind of, we have made a significant step forward during the pandemic. We have a new master plan in place for the Ulster Museum, and the concept at the core of that is your story, our story in our world. I think the Ulster Museum is, in many respects, well, it's almost going to say uniquely placed, but it's certainly very well placed to open up conversations that range from local to global. And I think that's, we really value that as a particular characteristic of the museum. We have been rethinking quite fundamentally the role and purpose of the Ulster Folk Museum, with an increased focus on well-being and sustainability, and also just what the museum offers in terms of as an environmental asset. The Ulster American Folk Park is, in many respects, probably closest to a conventional or to the visitor attraction model, but at the same time, we do see there being important opportunities there to develop the museum, and particularly with regard to expanding the narrative. And I think actually kind of in many respects, the biggest challenge we have from the point of view of the whole kind of decolonizing the museum kind of agenda is really actually at the Ulster American Folk Park, and its kind of treatment of limited treatment of narratives of slavery, etc. And the Ulster Transit Museum, again, which has not benefited really from a clear vision going forward into the future, is now being rejuvenated and kind of with new initiatives like the Museum of Innovation, which opened in July. And again, all of the development work that went into that, was carried out and undertaken during the pandemic. So, we haven't been marking time over the past 2 years waiting for the museums to reopen. We have been actually, engaging in important new thinking and new ways of, continuing to develop our new ways of working. And I think maybe most exciting in a practical sense is that, we obviously the collection has been inaccessible during lockdown. It's been inaccessible to us, and it's been inaccessible to you. But we have been making major improvements in terms of our collection storage, documentation, and collections digitization, and that will create important new opportunities for research. We have a new collection management system being introduced, a new sort of system for managing our kind of digital images. We have a new store for transport and industry collections. You can see it there in the photograph. We're also bringing collections back to the Ulster Museum, to repurposing the original stores in the Ulster Museum. And I think that will really transform, I think, the opportunities for research at the Ulster Museum to have those collections present. And we're also taking forward a very interesting and quite exciting new initiative around our library and archives. And all of that, I think, creates a sort of a stronger research environment and some hopefully kind of great opportunities for collaboration in the future.
For us as well, the pause for thought, it enabled us to kind of clarify our position and our future direction around a number of key strategic issues that are relevant to us, but also I think more broadly across the museums and heritage sector. As JD had mentioned in his talk, a lot of kind of work had been going on, for example, with decolonisation, but this work was given new impetus and urgency over the course of the pandemic. And with decolonisation, I think it was particularly the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent Black Lives Matter protest, which JD also mentioned. And even closer to home, earlier this year, there was a racist attack, an arson attack at the Belfast Multicultural Centre. So these are the issues that we really need to engage with. And I think it was a bit of a wake-up call for museums and heritage organisations that it was not acceptable for us to be passive with these issues. And to us, decolonisation is fundamentally about tackling racism, injustice and exclusion. It's about increasing representation for people from different backgrounds across our museums, and it's about encouraging respect, tolerance and understanding. So we gave a lot of thought to this, and we made these 4 very kind of broad and high level commitments, which were approved by our board towards the end of last year. Those are to embed a decolonisation approach, because we recognise that decolonisation actually affects many aspects of our work, and it needs to be something that informs everything that we do. To interrogate our sites and collections, a lot of the issues that are talked about as part of decolonisation, for example, things like repatriation, those are in the kind of the histories of our collections and collecting and the legacies there. It's also about how collections and sites are interpreted, the stories that we tell there. So just 2 examples, we are working on a Rethinking World Cultures exhibition, which will open at the Ulster Museum next spring. And we are also looking at how we expand the narrative at the Ulster American Folk Park, as William has mentioned, because there are marginalised histories there, particularly around enslaved people and Indigenous peoples. We recognise that we need to nurture and learn from partnerships, particularly because a lot of the expertise and experiences relating to this lie outside the museum, and we really need to learn from others. So the image there is from ACSONI, the African Caribbean Support Organisation Northern Ireland, who we have been talking to over the last 6 months, and they have been really challenging us in a positive way and thinking how we can do things better and truly represent African and Caribbean experiences in our museums. And then the final one is just to be honest and transparent. This is quite difficult work often. It's work we are probably going to make some mistakes as we go. We are learning as we go, but we think it's really critical to be honest and transparent with people. And so we say, we do know we have much further to go with this work, but we are committed to act, change, listen, learn and develop. We've also been thinking about our positioning in terms of biodiversity conservation. You saw in our outcomes, we were looking that our work contributed to climate change mitigation and biodiversity conservation. JD in his talk mentioned about the climate crisis and what that means for museums. We are also looking at climate change and our carbon footprint, but I think particularly from a research perspective, we would have real priorities around biodiversity conservation. And that's because we recognise we're a scientific institution. We are custodians to really important natural habitats at a number of our sites. And we also have those natural sciences collections across zoology, botany and geology, which contains such critical big data about the world around us and about environmental change. And if we're going to unlock the potential of those collections, we really need to work very closely with researchers and academics. So we've been having conversations with biological sciences at Queen's, and I think there are real opportunities there. So as with decolonisation, we've just made, at the moment, very broad and high-level commitments to be developed over time. So we are looking to identify key objectives and priorities in our forward planning, and identifying that in the outcomes framework was the start of that, although it is just the start. We are rebuilding our natural sciences team because we need greater expertise within the organisation, and we've actually recently appointed a new senior curator of natural sciences who will start with us in the new year, and I think you will see a lot of change happening, and hopefully that will be a bridge between our organisation and the university. We have a really important resource in the form of the Centre for Environmental Data and Recording, which is a partnership between us and the Northern Ireland Environment Agency. And it's been part of our organisation for a long time, but sat slightly to one side, and we just think there's an opportunity to much better integrate it. We'll maximise key strategic partnerships, and those take many forms, including with other museums and with universities. We'll clarify our ethical position because, again, being custodians to these sites and these collections, I think we have to be very mindful of our ethical position on things like accepting sponsorship from fossil fuel companies, for example. And also we'll engage with our audiences. The image there is an autumn wildlife hunt, an event we have run at the Folk Museum before. We obviously had Dippy on tour from the Natural History Museum and did a lot of engagement around that. But more to do in that area, and that relates to the collections we have at the Ulster Museum, but again with how we're rethinking the Folk Museum. How can we connect people better with that natural environment that we have there? We've also taken the last 18 months as an opportunity to develop and also form new partnerships. We understand that our very best work comes from partnership, and we do have certain skills and expertise and experience within our own organisation, but there's so much out there that we can benefit from and can complement what we do. So we are looking at how we can widen knowledge about our collections. So, for example, we have been meeting with the Ulster Automobile Club. We recently showed them the new Museum of Innovation, and we're exploring ideas for how we can work together to kind of develop that collection and also better understand that collection. We do, as an organisation, engage with priority contemporary agendas like the legacy of the past and our contested histories here. And we have been working over the last 18 months with the Bloody Sunday Trust, Museum of Free Derry, and also Healing Through Remembering on a new conflict and legacy network. And in recent months, we have widened that out to be a broader discussion, including many of the smaller museums, the Lidenhall Library, Prony, National Museum of Ireland, etc. Because we think it's really important that we all work in different ways, and we all have different priorities, but that the kind of museum and heritage sector working in this area can speak as one about these important issues. And then knowledge and skill sharing within the sector is really important to us as well. And we have a new Memorandum of Understanding with the National Museum of Ireland, and we're focusing on a number of priority areas where we believe we can work well together, including language on the island of Ireland, and also biodiversity conservation, decolonisation, and the legacy of the past. So these are the kind of the key themes we are considering. We, as an organisation, we have a research policy from 2019. Around the same time, we developed our collaborative agreements with both Queen's and Ulster University. But we realised the need for a research plan, which really kind of drilled down into some of the detail and looked at how we would transform our ambitions into actions. So this research plan is very nearly ready and will soon be able to be shared with external partners, including yourselves. And it supports the delivery of our research policy. It's about us identifying and communicating what our key research priorities are. You've probably heard in our presentation some of those coming through, but I don't think we've been very good at articulating those previously. And with diminished resources on all sides, as has been discussed already, I think we really need to be able to focus on what are our priorities and how do they align with your priorities as a university. We do recognise that we need to develop our research infrastructure, and that will be part of our planning for the future. We want to enable research partnerships in lots of different ways. There's many good examples of practice already, and the image there is from one of the scans of Takabuti, which was a project we worked on with, I know Eileen's on the call, with Queen's University and Manchester University, and we just want more of those kind of partnership projects between our organisations. And fundamentally, it's about increasing the visibility of and encouraging engagement with our collections. And then that all leads us up to the slightly elusive independent research organisation status, which we do not have as an organisation. And I think without it, we are slightly limited in what we can achieve in some of our research ambitions. So we have made that a priority within our new research plan about the steps that we need to go through to be able to apply for this status. We've had some really helpful advice and guidance from UKRI. JD and Pip and others have been extremely welcoming with us, enabling us to be an observer at the consortium and hear more from the different IROs about the work that they're doing. We had a really helpful phone call with the National Trust, who have quite recently achieved IRO status, and so we're learning from them. And we will be making our preparations for this application over the course of this year, and then we would hope to submit in the next business year. And the image there is just of the Bad Bridget project, which is partnership between Queen's and Ulster University. We're really delighted to have been brought in at a slightly later stage, and there will be an exhibition at the Ulster American Folk Park next year. And to us, that this kind of really represents the type of partnership work and the type of research we want to continue between our organisations. Because we're not an IRO, we haven't quite been able to enter this as an equal partner, even though it's still of huge benefit to us. But we think the IRO status will unlock greater opportunities for us, and hopefully you as our local, as our nearest university in many ways, we hope it will open up opportunities for you as well. So that's all from us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hannah and William, for that. Lots again to think about there, and opportunities, I think, for collaboration as we move ahead. Finally, last but not least, then we're going to hand over now to Siobhan from the Northern Ireland Museums Council. And Siobhan, you're going to tell us how things are from the perspective of museums in Northern Ireland. Thanks for that.
Thank you very much. I'm Shivan Stevenson. I'm Director of Northern Ireland Museums Council, and the Council is the development organisation for local museums in Northern Ireland. We're responsible for accreditation of local museums and offer grants, training, networking and support for our member museums, affiliated organisations and individuals. We represent 40 accredited and many more non-accredited museums. The Northern Ireland Museums Council were very active during COVID, particularly in providing opportunities for communication between museums and platforms for discussion on a range of issues. We changed our remit slightly, offering our training free online and at no cost for our own members. And the pandemic offered an opportunity to NIMC as a focus point, and I think the organisation was able to offer some leadership, which was appreciated by our members. The insights I'm going to share with you are based on the dialogue that we've had with the sector over the months and years. And it's not based on any collected statistics or museum surveys, but I hope it will provide some insight. You'll not be surprised, and other speakers have mentioned it, that the pandemic has had serious implications for museums, particularly in terms of resources and revenue. The main consequence of lockdown was the reduction in income streams for museums, ticket revenue, shop and cafe revenue, but also revenue in the forms of events and activities. And some impacts were perhaps less obvious than others. For example, the Railway Preservation Society of Ireland and Downpatrick Railway both raised substantial revenue through steam train trips, which could not take place. Many museums also use their spaces for event hire, and some have rental revenue, which was affected due to the policy on legal action on tenants, and also the failing retail sector. It's also worth noting that some museums have membership income, and in some ways, surprisingly, that does seem to have held up for many organisations, despite the withdrawal of some of their membership services. The loss of revenue, I think, impacted most heavily on those who had the largest self-generated income. And ironically, I think that's the museums that seemed to be most viable before the pandemic. Most museums were dependent in some form on the COVID relief schemes, which were put in place by a wide range of funders, including the resources from the executive administered through the National Lottery Heritage Fund. The impact of the pandemic has been felt quite differently by independent and local museums. In terms of costs for museums, there were a lot of costs that were inescapable. For a lot of independent museums, core costs, including things like insurance, governance and financial services and facilities costs, were still there. And in many cases, these were increased as a consequence of the pandemic. Local authority museums needed to worry less about these costs and were perhaps more concerned with retaining services and the ability to undertake checks during lockdown, with access heavily restricted. A number of museums experienced incidents such as flood, vandalism and pests due to reduced vigilance. In terms of staffing, museums, both independent and local authority, furloughed workforce during the pandemic, particularly front of house staff, but in some organisations furloughed the majority of staff. The consequence of this is that there's been a huge variation in the ability of museums to offer services, even services on alternative platforms. The relaxation to the partial furlough really helped some to grasp opportunities by having part-time staff, which enabled them to regain ground on collection or online activities. Some took the opportunity to move content online, and this has had massive benefits, extending audiences beyond the normal locality, and some tremendously to very far-flung areas. It has, however, been very difficult, if not impossible, for museums to monetize any of the online activities in the same way as they can with in-person visits through direct ticketing or indirect revenue raising. Of the independent museums, some are very heavily dependent on volunteers. And while this was unaffected by furlough, many of those volunteers fall into the retired or older generations. This has been particularly difficult as many previously active volunteers were shielding or minimising their contact with others. The issue of retaining social distance prevented many from regaining front of house roles as volunteers, and many volunteers remain reluctant to go back to previous levels of activity. Local authority museums, on the other hand, had staff redeployed to other service areas that were considered a priority during the pandemic, and many of them are now reporting difficulty regaining staff to their original duties. In terms of the recovery, and very broadly speaking, independent museums felt the impact of COVID strongly across the 18 months of lockdown, but are now beginning to see their income streams return. And although some have experienced difficulty in meeting the backlog of maintenance that COVID produced, which has delayed them getting up and running, many of them are up and running and reporting good visitor numbers. Local authority museums were in part shielded from a little of the immediate impact, but are now seeing severe budget cuts as a result of the pandemic and due to challenges faced by local authorities who see reductions in rates income and have stretched budgets in other parts of their service delivery. There are a number of museums who are still struggling to reopen as they depend on work being done to meet statutory obligations on maintenance and health and safety, which just hasn't happened due to COVID. There are a number who have lost staff and have been able to recruit in order to re-establish services. And there are some, including a couple of accredited local authority museums, who are unlikely to reopen as they are considered of peripheral importance as cost savings and even space requirements take priority. We cannot underestimate the strain that dealing with a major crisis affecting funding and with the need to constantly revise and rewrite policies and risk assessments has had on museum staff, both voluntary and employed. Many museums opened most recently in May. Most museums are recording lower footfall than previously, with visitors down by around a third. But in some ways, that's not bad. Many did report a surprising uptake for school groups in the weeks before the summer, and there are very recent signs that visitor numbers are picking up in September. The impact of the staycation was perhaps not as good as it should have been. Pre-booking was a deterrent to visitors, and there's strong evidence that making drop-in visits easier is going to produce better visitor numbers. There are positives. There's been widespread recognition of cultural opportunities being one of the things that people really missed in lockdown. In some quarters, this has led to an increased appreciation of museums and the role they play. Benefits in terms of well-being, educational value, and museums as safe spaces are perhaps now being acknowledged more than they have before. It's clear that the emphasis on visitors through the door is not now considered the sum measure of a museum's success. This could be very beneficial in freeing museums to explore more imaginative ways to interact with audiences and could place an increased emphasis on engaging using digital means. The rapid uptake of digital technology has meant that it's now acceptable to hold meetings and even engagement sessions online rather than in person. This has benefited rural museums who always had the challenge of travelling to reach meetings or training events. Likewise, there's a benefit in terms of the ability to network with museums in other parts of Ireland and the UK. I myself have benefited from attendance at regular meetings with museum development partners across the UK and Ireland in a way that could not have been possible before the pandemic. This support system has helped highlight museums in Northern Ireland in a way that has been difficult previously. There has been a general reduction over the pandemic in the capacity in museums, and this is a combination of the reduced resource, both financial and staffing, combined with increased workload for enabling visitors to access services in a safe way. I think it's fair to say that there's a great deal of anxiety over the ability of museums to embrace the new digital challenges and still go back to business as usual. Museums are also having to rethink operating models and some of their service delivery and are constantly adapting to changing guidance and visitor perceptions about how safe the environment is. There is evidence already that apart from the large COVID funds, that there's now a reduced capacity for museums to apply for funding. All large funders are experiencing a drop-off in applications since recommencing their normal grant provision. And this does seem true to almost an extra extent in Northern Ireland. So against the backdrop of this, where are the research areas? We have been working with Queen's University on a number of projects, including the Museums Empire and Northern Irish Identity Project, and are happy to work to get discussion going and provide feedback or a route to meet with our local museums. Our monthly Let's Talk sessions are likely to continue. That was an initiative introduced through COVID. and provide an informal platform for museums to engage on a wide range of issues. We have been collaborating on student placements by performing a sort of dating agency function with local museums. And this model might be considered a useful way to look for potential research projects. We need to know things like what collections are of interest and what are the priorities, both from the point of view of the research community and from the point of view of museums. The needs and requirements of museums are as varied as the museums we have themselves. I think museums will respond very positively to genuinely collaborative projects that help them deliver as well as build their research base. However, limited capacity will mean that there needs to be a good fit with their existing priorities. In general, I would also say that in comparison with the rest of the UK, there's a paucity of data on museums in Northern Ireland, and this has a knock-on effect when looking at museums and their impact within wider society. The strength of our local museums is that they're embedded in their communities and are valued in safe places. I think research that looks at the value of museums, that looks at museums and change and museums and a sense of place would all be very, very gratefully received. Digital partnerships and looking at the use of digital is a big area for museums. And I think Northern Ireland Museums Council will be looking to help museums to retain and to develop their digital services. So again, possible avenues for collaboration there. In general, I would echo what JD said, in that if there's a good fit, there will be lots of enthusiasm, but that there are capacity issues that need to be taken into consideration when thinking about research with local museums. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. So we had three excellent sessions there, in which I think it was so interesting to see from the major cultural institutions all the way through to small local museums, the extent to which the pandemic has not just created massive challenges, but has also given an opportunity to pause, to rethink, and to strategize for where next, and looking to develop research in new and interesting ways. I know there'll be a lot of discussion around those issues, but what I would suggest, just looking at our schedule, we actually are at the point where we're going to offer you guys a comfort break. So what we're going to do is we'll take a quick break now. We'll maybe reconvene in just under 10 minutes. So back here at 12:05. We'll move on to the second session then, and then take all your questions and comments at the end. And I know Keith will be happy enough to convene that. Thanks, Keith. So comfort break now. Thanks again to our speakers, and we'll see you in 6 or 7 minutes.
Comfort break for us. We are being recorded, and as I said in my comments, I think it's great that we can record this, and I think there's going to be lots to chew over, to be honest, as a consequence of this discussion. It's been really, really interesting listening to the panelists over the past hour, and I think there'll be comments. Please do put comments in the chat and questions. So we are going to start the second session, which Professor Eileen Murphy will be chairing for us, which is, as you can see from the programme, I hope, Archives, Landscapes and Archaeology. So we're going to take this panel, and then the idea, I think, now is to offer some scope in the final part of the whole session, just before 5 to 1 there, for any comments and questions, and maybe we can have some discussion. I think it's really great if we can have some discussion, but my impression is we probably will need to have yet another Zoom meeting at some point to to continue these conversations. I think there's some really interesting stuff coming out here. So please do pop those comments in the chat. I'm going to be quiet now and pass over to Eileen. Thanks, Eileen.
Thanks, Keith. Welcome back, everybody. So we've had a fantastic first panel, and I'm sure the second will be just as good, with so much more food for thought as well. So as Keith said, we're changing emphasis slightly in this session to archives, landscapes and archaeology. So again, we've got 3 speakers. Our first is Pip Wilcox, who's from the National Archives, where she's head of research, and she also leads the research and academic engagement team. Then we have Frances Bailey, who's the Senior National Curator for Northern Ireland, focusing on social and Irish history with the National Trust. And then last but not least is Dr. Will McGarry from from Queen's University Belfast here. So Will's a senior lecturer. He specialises in GIS and heritage management, and he's done a huge amount of work with World Heritage Sites and looking at issues like climate change. So without further ado, if I can pass over to Pip, please. Is Pip here?
Hello.
Oh, hi.
Thank you, Eileen. Sorry, I was reaching to turn off mute. Thanks so much for the invitation today and for that introduction. And thanks to Kevin and Liz for organising today. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I was so sorry to miss the first of these conversations. That was a couple of years ago. JD mentioned it. Yeah, who can remember when we used to have air travel and strikes that could interrupt that air travel? But I'm really happy to be with you, if not quite in person today. These are timely discussions, and I've been fascinated to hear other people's reflections on the pandemic, on current concerns, and our work into the future. I'm looking forward to the rest of today as well. I warned Liz when I was first invited that the National Archives might not be the most representative among independent research organisations for what happened during the pandemic. Our friends in other IROs and cultural heritage organisations, particularly those more dependent on visits for income, as we were just hearing about a moment ago from Siobhan, have fared far worse than us. We were extraordinarily fortunate. Nobody was furloughed, nobody was made redundant. We have a statutory duty to make public records available to the public. So we were also in the first tranche of cultural heritage organisations allowed to open to the public, albeit obviously in a limited way at first. So ours may not be a typical pandemic experience, but I will happily share some of the work that's been going on at the National Archives. Before I move on to research in particular, I'd like to acknowledge the people who made everything that we've done possible. The cleaning, security and operations colleagues kept us safe and secure throughout the most challenging periods and continue to do so. Our colleagues in IT supported everyone going online, entirely online, obviously, just brilliantly. And with our role as archives sector lead in England, colleagues have supported people working in and using archives across the country, working closely with colleagues further afield to beyond England, obviously, and around the world. And our colleagues who work directly with the public, from reception to record specialists, are doing sterling work. Enabling them are less visible people, everything from collecting documents and catering to developing and implementing a brand new online seat booking system. This is all the stuff that's happened sort of on top of or in new ways because of the pandemic. It's all additional labour and most of it's invisible. So I just wanted to call that out. We only work because we're a team. We all pull in one direction, and our department, which is research and academic engagement, as Eileen just mentioned, is one part among others. We're all working to fulfil our vision that we set out in Archives for Everyone, to become an inclusive, disruptive and entrepreneurial archive. All these 3 areas are important to us, and our research, as you can imagine, plays strongly into all of them. It's by its nature entrepreneurial, it's always new. By its nature, it disrupts the status quo, and we always keep inclusivity at its heart. These a particular focus for us at the National Archives, as for other organisations that we've heard about, is becoming inclusive, becoming more inclusive. And we have a scheme of work currently being led from the Chief Executive's Office on becoming the inclusive archive. We also have a way to go and are working often in partnership across all the departments within the National Archives on this, from recruiting people more representative of our society as a whole, to looking at problematic language in our collections and descriptions, and working to uncover the shared histories that have so often been silent or silenced in the stories that we have told. These among many, many other areas. But it's this approach overall, that we're one organisation working to fulfil this vision, that's guiding the new approach to research that we're developing. That with Valerie Johnson, our Director of Research and Collections, we're introducing a more structured approach to research, ensuring that it feeds directly into the wider work of the National Archives, and building paths so individual excellent research projects feed into broader programs in support of these wider objectives. This new approach was already in the early stages of development when the pandemic hit. It's not a response to it, but it is guiding our work as we emerge, or perhaps start to emerge, from the worst ravages of the pandemic. And it fits with wider activities too. Just for example, our colleagues in events and exhibitions are taking an even longer term approach than previously to their work. So with many years advance warning, we're able to work alongside them to develop partnerships and research projects that will feed into those upcoming exhibitions years down the line. Another important example would be our collective work against climate change, coming together at the moment in a number of events we're engaged with and organising around the upcoming COP26 conference. So at the National Archives, we conduct research in a wide variety of fields in common with most of our colleagues across cultural heritage. Lots of them have science in their titles. We've got computer science, archival science, conservation and heritage science. And of course, I think the research that perhaps people expect most from us, which is the humanistic or the social science approaches to our collections, to the contents of our records. By nature and by design, our work is multidisciplinary, and it's often interdisciplinary too. Digital research has been an area of growth for us over the past years, which set us up in good stead for what we hadn't foreseen, but what came last year. And there's a lot going on. I'd be happy to share later today or offline. I will keep this as brief as possible to allow everyone else to speak and for larger discussions later on. Not all areas fared equally well during the pandemic. Digital research data analysis, for example, could continue. Directly collections-based research was harder. Many of you will be aware of the Towards a National Collection research programme funded by the AHRC, and the so-called foundation projects, the smaller starter projects, kicked off pretty much exactly as we went into lockdown. We were lucky enough to be leading 2 of them, but given how very digital they were and how widespread the partners, we were always planning to collaborate remotely, so we just collaborated more remotely. Very happy to talk more about them later as well. But the brilliant researchers and external collaborators whose work needed access to the collections found imaginative ways to keep going somehow. There are so many examples I could give, but if I may, I'll focus on one that exemplifies the adaptability and resilience that was visible across people and teams. So Beyond 2022, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's led by Peter Crooks at Trinity College Dublin, funded by the Irish government, with Neil Johnston and Paul Dryber at the National Archives and Tim Murtagh at Prony, and a large cast of other researchers, far too many to name here. When COVID restricted in-person archival access, the archival discovery team shifted attention to the catalogue research during lockdown, and thanks to the generations, centuries of generations of colleagues who came before us and made this possible, and to the goodwill and dedication of specialists and curators in many libraries and archives. So work continued apace once access to repositories was restored late in 2020. At TNA alone, sorry, the National Archives, terrible habit of mine, at the National Archives alone, and not including the State Papers Ireland, the team identified over 200,000 individual Irish or Irish-related records in this period. Attention of the project also turned to digital infrastructure, collaborating to design its architecture to repopulate the virtual record treasury destroyed, as I'm sure everyone here knows, in 1922. The project team adapted quickly to these new opportunities. So, for example, when the Royal Irish Academy made the content of its Dictionary of Irish Biography openly available, they formed a partnership, and now its post-1169 data forms part of the knowledge graph, the project's knowledge graph, and is linked to its archival record. Once we were allowed back in the building, our digitisation team could take up their work again. 450 medieval parchment rolls have been digitised for this project, and this on top of other work that currently includes, for example, digitising the 1921 census. That's another busy team. But with the forced change in focus, there's been more time for partnerships to develop within the project and across its host organisations. For example, in a technical workshop chaired by our digital director, John Sheridan, with us, where colleagues came together to understand how the outputs from this research project could inform and benefit from current work on our public digital offering. This is the tip of the fabulous Beyond 2022 iceberg, and it's a great example of record specialists, archivists, librarians, curators, working hand in hand with academic researchers, with research software engineers, and with infrastructure developers in partnerships that are based on local and specialist knowledge and span regions and countries. So I've mentioned a few of our many collaborative projects, and wouldn't want to leave off without also talking about our students. The Collaborative Doctoral Partnership and Collaborative Doctoral Award students, we co-supervise the Collaborative Doctoral Partnership, I'm sure many of you will know, is led by JD across the IROs. And we've been supervising through this hugely vulnerable time in their professional lives, where students, I think in particular, have been badly affected. Our academic engagement team have been offering support and help at every stage, as well as working to develop new partnerships for future studentships that also take account of these new ways of working, both the opportunities and the evident difficulties. These new ways of working with equity and inclusivity at their centre have permeated our academic events too, with colleagues fast becoming expert in how to run excellent online events like this one. There are limitations. Wouldn't it be lovely to have a cup of tea together again? But also bonuses, particularly in the reach, as Siobhan and Hannah also noted. People unable to come to us in Kew, for example, in person, or at least to come often, become sort of first-class citizens when everyone is online. And an example of this, the enormously successful treatment roundtables, so-called, that were introduced by our collection care colleagues. They had an internal audience in mind, but little by little, people found out about them and asked to come along, and of course the more the merrier. So now they're a regular fixture on the international conservation and heritage science scene. I'll close much more parochially, if I may, with a mention of our research and academic engagement team itself. We lead on the strategy and management of research, including developing researchers and the research culture internally and building partnerships externally, as well as enabling research. We conduct research ourselves, and this team's actually grown. It's more than doubled over the period, as I said at the start, somewhat against the flow of what happened across most of cultural heritage. I did say we were unusually fortunate. But this larger team helps us support our more structured and professionalised approach to research. And we also are about to start a new grants and funding office. I think it will open in November, and that will give us more capacity yet to develop partnerships and deliver excellent collaborative research. So I'm sorry if I presented too Pollyanna a version of these last months. I echo JD in describing the pain there's been across our sector, and from everyone I've talked to across higher education too. We miss the interaction with colleagues and visitors that sparks ideas and creativity. We miss the objects, the records in our case, that are at the heart of our work. We miss engaging with students and communities and individuals and learners in person. But we have found ways to continue and to grow in ways that were often already in the works. Other people have noted this as well, but are now even more highly valued, such as, for example, the establishment of the National Archives Trust, with its mission of taking the archives to people around the UK, and also new virtual classrooms that were already planned and have since been built, from which colleagues at Kew can reach people further afield. The comfort, the solace, and even the joy in the middle of hardship that people have found in our collective collections, in understanding and engaging with our shared histories, and gatherings such as this, which bring people together with joint aims across research and cultural heritage, is heartening. It speaks of a bright future, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pip. It's very heartening to hear, that the National Archives did so well, could manage so well through COVID. And I mean, I think that's been one of the things that's really struck me in all the talks so far, that the positivity and the resilience and how quick, all of the organizations have been to adapt to change. So as you say at the very end there, the future, I think, is definitely really bright. So we'll move on then to our next speaker. So we've got Frances Bailey from the National Trust. So I'll hand over to you, Frances.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Great, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this wonderful gathering of people. And I'm really sorry I missed the one 2 years ago. I know that it was a great success. And I've been so struck by the similar experiences of so many of our speakers today through the past year and a half or more. This has very much been reflected in the experience of the National Trust. And I just wanted to say a little bit about the Trust for people who are maybe not as familiar with how it's set up and what we do. But we were incorporated in 1895 as a charity. as the National Trust for Places of Historic Interest or Natural Beauty for the benefit of the nation. So we are a charity, we depend on income from members, visitors, estate rental, gifts and legacies, grant aid and external funders. We don't receive any direct government funding, and we are also independent of government, which is a great strength in many ways. And then we also have in the past couple of years received independent research organisation status, which is a fantastic thing. In Northern Ireland, we have a very broad range of properties, but you can see them here. They're broadly distributed across Northern Ireland, and they encompass landscape and historic buildings and archaeological sites and scheduled monuments, and it's a fantastic gathering of places. We are incredibly dependent on international tourism. And one of our biggest places, the Giant's Causeway in Carrick-a-Reid, brings in most of our visitors, or at least normally did. So we have been hit pretty hard during the pandemic, which of course meant that international tourism pretty much ceased, and many of our places had to be closed. There were lockdowns and restrictions, and like many other organisations, we were very hard hit. Almost every aspect of our income was affected, leading to a full review of the organisation's spending and priorities last year, with changes implemented to save over 100 million annually on our sort of annual budget through restructuring, redundancies and non-pay cuts. And we had to take some pretty stringent cost-saving measures, including the pausing or deferring of projects and the furloughing of staff. In fact, most of our curators and many other discipline areas were furloughed last year. This had an inevitable impact on research projects. And like all other organisations here today, COVID has concentrated our minds on the most essential parts of our work. In terms of research, the main impacts were that it really focused us on our strategic needs. How does research support the delivery of our strategy and our core aims? It has encouraged us to embrace the opportunities for participation in externally funded projects and research. But we also have fewer staff and less time. So there is potentially limited resource to supervise or support research on site. During lockdown, we concentrated on our core purpose, essential conservation and maintenance, combined with keeping our members engaged. So there was a lot of digital online activity. Nature, beauty and fresh air were the main focus for access, both physical and virtual. And goodness, they were important. So just the opportunity to be able to get out eventually into our gardens, but into our open spaces, and then gradually as houses opened back to see real places and real things was enormously important for people's mental health. Our new research strategy is focused on access and inclusion, conservation and sustainability. Our IRO status means that we have more flexibility in leading on research projects and focusing on research that will help us deliver our core purpose. And there were learnings and feedback from the Legacies of Slavery and Colonialism report, which was a report that we issued last September. Although we've been working on it for a couple of years, it coincided with the eruption of the Black Lives Matter movement, and which actually gave it, incredible agency. And actually, one of the great things to have come out of that, I mean, the impacts are really far-reaching. There was a lot of press coverage, positive and negative reactions. And within the Trust, it has really deepened our resolve to explore difficult histories connected with our places and to share them more widely. Research into our places is part of our core remit. And Hilary McGrady, our Director General, who lives in Northern Ireland, of course, made this statement: having lived all of my life in Northern Ireland, I know only too well the impact of allowing cultural identity to become a source of division. I want the Trust to be dedicated to finding ways of making the arts, culture and heritage a vehicle for bringing people together, for shared acknowledgement, respect and understanding. the National Trust must continue to take a wide-ranging and evidence-based approach to history. We are here for all of history, for everyone, forever. And I can't tell you actually how empowering that was, because so many aspects of our work in the Trust have been geared towards tourism and visitor experience and the sort of, you know, fun day outside of things, that it is wonderful now to have the reassurance that our core historical research significance recognized and at the center of what we do, that all our places are not just places for fun. They are places for fun, but they're also places where you can learn incredible stories about the past, and engage with all those stories. Just a little overview of some of the current or recent collaborative research projects that have been happening at a national level. Everything from addressing issues around climate change in the top left, thinking about landscape futures. This research will help the Trust have more confidence in decision making, and also work with regulators to develop new decision support frameworks for how we decide about when to let cliffs erode or beaches disappear. And these are very emotive issues and need to be dealt with very carefully. The Art Fund Award to build an LGBTQ+ heritage network to shape practice across the sector was written as a PhD placement, and it won the award for Best Partnership at the 2021 Museums and Heritage Awards. The Irish Research Council and UKRI funded 3D Craft is testing methods to widen access to heritage through technology, using Clandon as a case study. Clandon burnt, had a very severe fire about 4 years ago now. And the restoration process of that and the understanding of its fabric has been an amazing opportunity actually to understand how the place was built. And then the Renew bid to NERC to improve how we engage people with nature and to explore the barriers to making nature conservation more accessible. These are just a few, giving an idea of the very wide range of research opportunities that we've been involved in. Our research strategy, which is currently being rewritten, it's 5 years old now, and 2021 is the year for it to be updated. So it's very timely. And this page and the next, obviously they're being recorded in this, but I will make them available to anybody who wants to have them. They are draft at the moment, but what they do is give you an idea of the national priority topics here on the left-hand side, very broad ranging, covering everything from people, heritage and place, heritage understanding, environmental practices, responding to our environmental change and land-based economies, sustainable production, ecosystem planning, to lived experiences and social histories, artistic and cultural production and reception, and global and national connections. I mean, these are big, chunky issues, and they are relevant very much to what the National Trust does and how we interpret our places. And here we have those same headings, though I've excluded the environmental ones for the moment and concentrated on the more cultural heritage focused topics, but thinking also about how they are relevant in a Northern Ireland context. What are the things we want to explore here? And some of those are especially around the emphasis on inclusion. It's interesting how many of the speakers today have been talking about this. Inclusion, inclusive histories, understanding more about the barriers that might prevent people from visiting our places. And many people may not worry particularly that many of our places were built by white upper class Anglo-Irish or Anglo-British people, but some people are deeply worried by that. Are there problems with transport, simple logistical issues? Are there problems with finance because you have to pay to get into our properties? We also continue to research the stories of our places, their builders, creators, and the residents, in order to share more about their lived experiences, and the global connections, looking at digital resources to capture and share these stories. We now have the opportunity, coming out of the Legacies of Slavery and Colonialism report and the whole drive from the Black Lives Matter phenomenon, to think more deeply about the stories behind our places. What have we not been saying? What have we not been telling? What have we not researched because we haven't had the opportunity? And I think it's important to think about way back during the Troubles. The Trust kept a very low profile in terms of its sort of political, how it might be viewed politically, and deliberately avoided in its guided tours areas of history that might have been contentious, and that's sort of been a bit of a legacy that we, now is absolutely the time to be thinking about this and thinking how we can delve deeper into these things about Orangism and unionism and nationalism, and how those are represented at our places, and how we express those stories. So the message is, we're keen to support and engage in research at all levels, aligned with our strategy. We want to ensure that the outputs and the outcomes support our work and our aims. And we acknowledge that our staff numbers are limited and everyday workload is heavy, so we will need your help in delivering the research that we need to make our places even better, more engaging, and more inclusive. And I would welcome any contact from anybody who wants to hear more about research opportunities with the National Trust. We can offer a range from collaborative research projects, which will probably need the Central National Trust Research Board involvement, to internships of various lengths to research Northern Irish property related or subject specific areas. And those research initiatives, the sort of smaller scale ones, can be approved at a local level. So please talk to us. We'd love to talk to you. And here are our contact details. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Frances, for another fantastic talk. I think your talk and those of all the other speakers just show just how impactful on society in a positive way museums and the National Trust and the archives, all these places are, because sometimes you get a feeling they get a bit downplayed in terms of importance by governments, but all these organizations are feeding into major issues like diversity and inclusivity and climate change. So they really do have a positive impact on society, not to mention the whole well-being aspect. And COVID really showed the positive mental health effects of the great outdoors, and how people want to connect with place and with these different institutions. So it's just so hugely important, and like I say, I just fear sometimes it can be a bit undervalued in the broader scheme of things. So it's brilliant to see all this sort of strategic planning going on in the different institutions that really will hopefully help raise the profiles, and hopefully the universities can be part of that. So for example, we're developing an MSc in climate change, and I would really hope there's going to be scope for collaborative projects across all the institutions here today with that as well. Okay, so enough from me. I will now pass on to our final speaker, Dr. Will McGarry from Queen's.
Great, Eileen. Thank you very much, and thank you to the organisers for asking me to speak here today. My name is Will. I'm a senior lecturer in archaeology in the School of Natural and Built Environment. And I think I was asked to come and speak today because a lot of my research and a lot of the work I do is quite collaborative, both nationally within Northern Ireland, where I have worked with NMNI, currently have a PhD student based at the Cultra Folk Museum, but I've also worked with the National Trust on World Heritage issues, and then internationally I'm involved in a number of projects, one called the CVI Africa project, which is looking at climate vulnerability training in Africa, and involves 14 partners on 4 different continents. So you can imagine what scheduling Zoom meetings for that is like, and more on that a little bit later, I think, in terms of maybe some of the pitfalls of COVID. But I'm also co-chair of the upcoming UNESCO IPCC ICOMOS meeting on culture and climate change, which is working a lot with Indigenous groups and communities. And I think the advances in capacities which we have experienced over the last 18 months have actually been a benefit in many of those situations in allowing us to engage and communicate with stakeholders who perhaps are often quite difficult to engage meaningfully with. So I think what I'd like to do today, probably just for about 5 minutes so that we have some time for discussion, is to highlight some of the good, and a lot of that will be quite repetitive or will confirm what people have said already, but also some of the pitfalls that I have encountered over the last year, 18 months, which I'm sure for you, many of you like myself, has been really quite an incredible learning curve, both positively and negatively at times. So we've heard a lot today about accessibility. It's also really nice to hear the term inclusivity being used a lot, and the impacts of BLM and the need to decolonize museums, the accessibility for rural museums and local heritage groups of being able to get involved in research has been incredible. But this issue of accessibility really does have to be considered within the wider context of inclusivity. What I mean by that is, I think COVID and the capacities we have developed in terms of even having this meeting now on Zoom have enabled us in many ways to be more inclusive and to include more people. So if I think of an example from my Africa project, this is an AHRC funded grant, which has been providing training for a cohort of African heritage professionals, and is also running 2 workshops at very, very rural sites, one in southern Tanzania and one in northern Nigeria. Now, when we wrote this application, COVID was on the radar, but I think like most people, we thought it was going to be done in 6 months. We thought that there would be a strategy. And so whereas while we did think of COVID mitigation, it would be fair to say the majority of that project was still envisioned as happening into some way in person. And actually what has happened is we will be finishing it in December this year, aligning it with the Conference of Parties, the COP in Glasgow, which we've already heard about. But it's actually been 100% remote. We haven't been able to do a single part of it remotely, in person. And that's been an incredible challenge, but it's also forced us all to work out new ways of engaging with each other, especially engaging with partners in the global south. This, I think, question of inclusivity and accessibility provides us with a huge opportunity to reach out and work with organizations who previously might have been excluded from what we were able to do. To give one example of this, in our training course, we had one wonderful participant who would join us on their mobile phone from under an acacia tree in the Serengeti every week for training. It's hard to imagine a world where that would happen prior to COVID. I think the flip side of that inclusivity is a need for us as large organizations, universities certainly, and perhaps also heritage organizations, to try and break down traditional practices of gatekeeping, which are prevalent in our sector. By gatekeeping, what I mean is infrastructure, either intentional or non-intentional, which restricts the involvement of certain individuals. It might be young parents, people from minority backgrounds. And I think gatekeeping, it remains a problem, and that whereas we can be more inclusive, we need to be careful not to put in place bureaucracy, residency requirements for working with really bright students, partnering with people around the world, forcing people to jump through hoops, which make it very, very difficult to engage properly. So we need to be careful that this increased inclusivity that I think we have, not to actually put in place things that will minimize that or reduce that. The second issue I'd like to talk about after inclusivity is this question we've talked about already. And it's interesting that every person has talked about climate change and talked about carbon action and carbon mitigation. And I think that museums, universities are quite similar in many ways when it comes to climate action. We have challenges with regards to infrastructure, with regards to research, with regards to looking after our collections. And I think one of the things we should think about going forward is looking about where our strategic priorities for climate action align between our organizations and trying to also align our research strategies accordingly. Similarly, the ability to do things like this, like meet remotely, has a huge effect on our carbon footprint, not just in terms of us not hopping on planes to meet each other, but also in terms of us not being in our buildings with power on all the time. And I think that that is one of the things that we should seek to actually maintain where possible. And the third point I'd like to make is one just of caution, which is that I think we need to be careful of the law of unintended consequences, or the law of unforeseen circumstances, with regards to how we react to the COVID situation. It's often easier to make changes than to reverse them. I've been involved in a number of discussions internationally about organizations who are very quick. Some people within the organizations are trying to equate digital access with physical access. And JD talked about how the importance of engaging with things and places, the National Trust's motto of for everybody, forever, that accessibility, that inclusivity, that we need to be careful not to allow some of the things that have been very necessary to put in place during COVID to have knock-on effects. We need to protect people's freedoms to right to access these things where necessary. And I was very struck by a recent report from the International Council of Monuments and Sites, which said that we urge all concerned to be conscious of how adjustments and innovations in social and spatial management systems may affect cultural heritage practices and places, and to ensure that these changes are implemented in the recovery process with a view to the safeguarding and survival of heritage values, tangible and intangible, cherished by communities. I think we need to be very proactive in our post-COVID response in keeping what works, but also being aware of where there might be unforeseen circumstances. So also, while there has been a lot of positive news regarding this, I think several of our speakers have touched on the fact that overall, the impact of COVID on heritage community has been very, very difficult. And I think as large organizations, we have a moral obligation to acknowledge that and to support those organizations where we can, because this pain is especially felt within minority communities, within traditional and indigenous communities globally. I think, and Eileen interestingly touched on this just prior to my speaking, but another point that I think we have to be very careful of is this question of welfare. The welfare of our students who might be involved in projects where access might be difficult, and the knock-on implications that might have on their research. We need to be aware of the welfare of partners around the world and the impacts of different time zones. This is my third back-to-back Zoom meeting today, for example, and I'm sure many of us are familiar with that feeling, where the benefits, which is being able to talk to people all over the world very easily, is often counterweighed by the fact that many of us don't leave our desks all day, and that is not sustainable working to the future. As we expand our networks, we're going to need to protect that work-life balance and look after those, especially those who we have a duty of care for within research, and specifically there I'm probably thinking about PhD students who have been whose research is time sensitive and has been negatively impacted by the pandemic. So that's kind of what I want to say. I think the key message here is let's keep what's working well, and there are many, many things, but let's also be honest about what's not, and let's be retrospective and reflective about that, and seek to remove those things from our new working practices. Thanks very much, Eileen.
Hey, thanks very much, Will. And I just loved your description about, somebody joining the training course from under an acacia tree in the Serengeti. It's just fantastic. But I also really do appreciate that you ended by kind of looking at the pros and cons, and summing up, how we do need to be cautious going forward. So that's the end of me now. I'm going to hand over to Professor Keith Lilly, who's going to chair the final discussion and question session.
Thanks very much, Eileen, and also for the panelists as well. Really interesting discussion emerging here. And we do have, as Eileen has just said, we do have some time now for some discussion and some questions and some comments. So I'm going to just field those. Now, the chat function is there. I'm sure we're all now, as Will is just saying, we're back to back on Zoom. So I think we're fairly familiar now with the various practices. So feel free to pop a question or comment, observation, reflection in the chat. I'll keep an eye on that. Equally, if anybody has a question they'd like to raise their hand, I will try and observe the hands. But before, so please think about that while I move on to what I was about to say, which is from the panelists' perspective, I'd just be interested to see and hear, in fact, from the panelists, having now had that kind of cross-section that we've received across the past couple of hours, whether anybody from the panelists would, or indeed the chairs from Olwyn and Eileen, have any sort of observations or reflections on what we've just been hearing. There certainly seems to be a certain amount of resonance and connection and convergence almost between some of what we've been hearing, but equally there's going to be points of divergence as well. So it's just an opportunity. We have a few minutes, about 10 minutes. Anybody from the panelists would like to offer some thoughts? Before I chip in? Well, keep thinking, Oh, sorry, Francis, do go ahead. I saw a hand there.
Hi, yeah, I was just reading Olwyn's piece in the chat, and that about dealing with difficult past, cultural identity, decolonization, and suggesting that there might be a colloquium about this. I think it would be a fantastic thing to do. I mean, there are so many commonalities between what we've been speaking about. There are so many issues that are common to us all here. And I would absolutely welcome such a thing. It would be great.
Owen? Oh, she's
gone. Sorry, I was demuting myself. Yes, thanks for that, Francis. I was really struck by just the way in which, from the very large museums all the way through to small institutions, that this is a theme that recurs, and it's the fact that COVID has allowed space to really think through these at the same time as they became such major issues in our society. So I think perhaps an opportunity to share experiences from, the national to the regional to the local would be really, really valuable, and to learn for each other. So something maybe a few months down the line, we could maybe try and pull something together. Okay, I'm happy to run with that.
Just one observation, which I think is that we've noticed really, which and it's been picked up in some of our conversations with Queen's academics, is really how there is a sort of increasingly, I think, a merging of disciplines, which is interesting and presents quite distinctive opportunities. And in the past, we would have always thought about almost like this holy trinity of art, natural sciences, and history. And to an extent, they kind of had separate lives. And I think that's really changing now. And I think the environment is a good case in point, on our response to climate crisis, which is has political urgency, which is absolutely a sort of a part of our within contemporary history, you might say, but also has a very obviously a sort of a scientific basis as well. And I think, as we rethink the Ulster Museum, part of the challenge is thinking how we reconfigure our galleries, that we have an approach that allows for connections across disciplines to be better expressed.
Yeah, I think the cross-disciplinary dimensions of the discussion have come out nice and strong. And I think, Pip, actually, you mentioned that specifically about multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, and certainly within the context of the university sector, that's a very strong direction of travel. The Heritage Hub itself was created to kind of promote that dialogue between the disciplines and try and avoid the siloization which can sometimes occur within the university sector between faculties and subject areas, when really, as we've been hearing about from all the contributions really, in these challenges around decolonization, around power relations, around climate change, the climate crisis, environmental impact, sustainability, resilience, these are all really challenging issues, but we can bring something to the table, I think, if we create these sort of fertile ground for dialogue between and within the disciplines. And not just in an academic sector, clearly, but across the sector, in the heritage sector, as we're trying to do today, and also the academic sector. So not siloizing ourselves. in terms of those bodies that we inhabit, institutional bodies, I mean. Sorry, so sorry, Hannah, I see your hands up. I see the hand. Do go ahead.
Just a quick point. I think pre-pandemic, the way that museums and heritage organisations operated, it was very much that success was equated with growth, and that was growth in terms of the kind of physical footprint of our organisations, in terms of visitor numbers, in terms of income. And as everyone, I think, has touched upon in different ways, that has gone out the window with the pandemic, which is probably positive for all of us. And I think much more now, success is around kind of impact, which aligns very closely with how you work in universities, and is about the difference we make in society. So I think this is a really kind of timely opportunity for us to seize upon that in museums and heritage organisations, but in partnership with universities.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's, oh, sorry, JD, go ahead.
No, you need, please, Keith, please answer Hannah.
Well, I was just thinking about geography and the importance of geography in all of this. And I suppose on some levels, there's sort of connections between the different heritage organisations represented in this discussion at different scales. And I think this is something that Francis touched upon. So, in one way, geography matters. The experience differs. It's differentiated geographically and spatially. But at the same time, there are points of convergence which kind of unify and unite us, irrespective of geography, dare I say, as a geographer. But also, I think that digital has helped make these connections. And some of the point that Will was making was collapsing time and space. And the digital media means that we are perhaps more on a leveler playing field, dare I say, perhaps. Although there's always a digital divide at work here, we have to recognize that. So I'm just interested in the geographical and the spatial aspects is what I was sort of reflecting or musing upon. But that, JG, do go ahead.
No, thank you. Firstly, I'd say I would also welcome a discussion around difficult histories in the future. That's something which I know many of the other IROs would be very keen to participate on. The thing I was going to say, rather than coming back to that question about geography, is one of the things I have found over the last 5-6 years, which has accelerated in the last year and a half, is as a head of research of a major cultural organization, I'm at home in the humanities. I'm an archaeologist. That's my natural home. But increasingly, the challenges which we are facing take us out of this. And that's, I think, a really interesting area. How do we just talk about these with university colleagues? So the digital turn towards a national collection, which Pip has mentioned, I don't know the first thing about any of this. I have to go and ask people, what are the best digital tools? So I have to go and find out for myself what I even need, let alone the language to explain this into digital experts, and then find the right digital experts. Thinking about some of the issues which are now facing us in terms of sustainability and climate change. I need to know about plastic. What happens to plastic? Is plastic storage boxes the future of museum storage? These are areas totally beyond my subject area, and I think, how do we find ways as people who are in charge of research for our cultural organizations to be able to talk with the right people in universities, to even find the right people to start the collaboration with, I think is a big question for me, and I think several other people would be really interested in talking more about.
Thanks. Yes, I think signposting is absolutely critical, and it's a criticism, absolutely fair criticism, I think, of the university sector. It's sometimes very difficult to know who we are and how we might be accessed. So I see now 3 hands, and so we have Pip and Will and Eileen. Pip, do you want to go first?
Oh, thanks very much. Not sure I had my hand up first, but thank you. Yes, it was responding to you, Keith, and also what JD's just said, absolutely, there's a tension between the people who are more generalists and can perhaps speak to more of the disciplines. Clearly, not everything. No one, I think, is as generalist as that. And the people who are specialists, who we absolutely need. It's their work that pushes us forward. So but I think I'm a huge fan of interdisciplinary working. That's what I've done my whole life, my whole working life, so I better be. And it's something that we're really keen on at the National Archives. But I'd like to acknowledge that it takes time. It takes time and patience and courage, actually. And a lot of people who are very specialist in their fields have spent a huge amount of time and energy and emotional labour getting to that point, and have to go into a room and start with, I don't know, and I'm listening. And all the shorthand that we all fall into when we're talking to our own people in whatever bit of hobby or life or work that we're in, we have to set that aside and be ready to meet people more than halfway. It takes a long time to build that trust, and it's completely amazing when it works well. But to assume that we can do it just sort of on the fly, let's have a chat with someone and suddenly I'll know enough about plastics to have an informed view or be able to put together a research proposal is absurd. I really welcome things like the Heritage Hub. I think it's the way forward is finding ways to cut across, take different cuts of our amazing organizations and institutions and find ways to bring people together, but also to be mindful of these individual human beings within this as well, and they also have their particular interests and careers that they need to develop. So we need to find ways of acknowledging all the different kinds of effort that go into it. So what gives you a big tick on an academic CV may not be the same, or may be the same as one within a cultural heritage organisation, but even beyond that, to think of the research software engineers, the people who build the digital infrastructure. So what they need is equally, they bring absolutely invaluable knowledge and experience to these collaborations, as do the subject experts, all the subject experts. But it's ensuring that all of them get the credit that's meaningful for them, and are all equally respected as co-equal partners. Thanks.
Thanks, Pip. So thanks, Will and Eileen. We have about a minute. No,
you know what, I think that actually made the point I wanted to make really well, which is that there's interdisciplinary that's easy and there's interdisciplinary that's hard. And I think it's the hard stuff we need to do. In my case, that's climate science. We've all talked about climate science here. How many climate scientists are there? One of the great things the National Trust have been doing is developing this climate impact map for climate scientists across the UK. Really valuable, interdisciplinary, but difficult because we all speak different languages, So my point of view.
Thanks, Will. So Eileen, over to you.
Hiya. No, I've just really enjoyed hearing everybody's kind of research strategies and areas of interest, because I'm kind of used to, knocking on the door of the Ulster Museum and bringing a project to the table to see if they're interested in partnering up. And I think I just was wondering, is there a way kind of that we could improve our sort of connections in that sense, because events like this are great, and those of us that are here, we now know about these sort of research priorities, but is there something that we can do in the university, maybe through Heritage Hub or something, to kind of seek projects from the external groups that are that the external groups want to promote, because at the moment it's to kind of facilitate that, because for example, the Northern Bridge Collaborative studentship program's about to be advertised if it hasn't been already. And it would just be great if there was a way to kind of bring in those ideas so that then academics across the university could kind of link in with the partner groups. And I just wondered, was there something practical that we could do to facilitate that in the universities?
I think it's a really good point to pretty much bring us to an end, Eileen. So I think that's actually the next step, isn't it? Is we need to think now to continue this conversation, to continue the momentum, to identify these challenges, begin to work with them between ourselves, and find those really interesting areas and develop those into collaborative projects, whether they're CDAs or externally funded projects or internally funded projects. So it's just finding that kind of platform to enable us to continue that conversation. It is now, I'm afraid to say, folks, time passes so quickly, doesn't it? It's 1 o'clock already. So we probably ought to draw things to a close. But I think Eileen has laid down the challenge for us. And I think it's between ourselves, maybe we can organise some additional, I think Olwyn as well, you had that thought too, some additional sorts of workshops, a bit like this, or events, sometimes smaller, sometimes larger, but I think the online provides us certainly with a kind of means of mechanism for doing that. So I'm conscious now, it is 1 o'clock. Everybody's got another Zoom meeting about probably already started. So there's a comment there just coming in. So I just want to say thank you ever so much to all the panelists for all of your time, your thoughts, your reflections. It's very much appreciated. We're busy people, and we really appreciate that you've come to the table and spent this time with us. Thank you to all of those who've joined us on the call, on the meeting, to Kevin and to Liz, and to Eileen as well as Olwyn as well for chairing. So thank you, everybody. We will be in touch again, I'm sure, very soon. Take care, everybody. Bye for now. Goodbye.